guys can't keep you away. But very excited for today. I want to thank my sponsors, Kukin Brothers up in New Jersey. They are guys I worked with, so I designed their line of classical American moldings. They are good people that get it. They ship their moldings all over the country. And then Windsor One, known them for about 20 years, designed their molding line. And so also good guys. They actually stock their stuff here in Texas. So if you're looking for good moldings and things, those guys are it. We are doing Victorian Part 2, okay? Who missed Part 1? A few of you. So it's really kind of difficult to kind of wrap up. Let me pull this forward so people can see over there. This Victorian era, I'm going to try to do it tonight. This is really kind of that period of 1830 to 1900. The Queen Anne period lasts until there's Queen Anne houses into the 1910s. So we're not, there's vernacular things and there's other stuff, and there are over 17 types of Victorian houses, okay? And that's in the books, and there's probably 100 different variations, if not 1,000. And so we're going to end tonight with a little quiz, see who can pick the style, because it can be confusing. So Victorian is this crazy era of time, exploding technology. There is fast-growing population. America, with all our immigration, with the railroad, with the expansion west, all these crazy things are happening. So we're going to study kind of the second half of that, and I'm going to try to tie it all together, if I can. Really, there's kind of two parts to this thing. There is the houses that we kind of know and love and appreciate and everything else. And then there's also the commercial side in the city. And so today we're going to be talking about the rise of the city and kind of what that does to how it affects building and everything else. So here we go. Each time I do these kind of snapshots of where we are in America, and as we get closer, maybe to our time period, I don't have to do that anymore. We're at 63 million people. We're expanding west very fast. The country has 46 of the 50 states. So New Mexico and Arizona become in 1912, Hawaii and Alaska are 1950. So we're at 46 states right now in 1890. The Continental Railroad joins the country in 1869. It's interesting, I was reading, there's the loss of the frontier. I mean, you hear that into the 1950s and 60s, but the loss of the frontier is something that's very real to people's hearts. This is kind of the French call it the La Belle Époque. I can't speak French. The last great generation, right? They're talking in these books that I've been reading that, with World War I, which happens 1915 to 1918, 1914, the technology that is started here, the science and all the things that are going on, show up in their worst way in World War I. With the mustard gas and the terrible technology, and then just killing people is just terrible. So the 1890 to 1910 is kind of the last, great epic, the great time period where expansion and growth and science and all these wonderful things are happening. And so we're kind of at the end of that. And then we're going to talk about the rise of the city and the city beautiful movement, New York and Chicago, and the kind of contradiction between a growing city and yet the problems that happen there. Just a quick snapshot of the country. Arizona and New Mexico become states in 1912, right? And so these are Hawaii's 1959, Alaska. So we're nearly complete. We nearly got the country together. This is an interesting map. This is a map of immigration population. And I think it was visually very captivating for me because of how this line comes across and stops right here. I think this is in 1890, maybe 1880, 1900. So, You see California growing, right? You see a little bit of stuff in Colorado, but really where the Great Prairie stops, the expansion kind of slows right here. These are immigrants, right? So this is the immigrant population coming in, but I like this map because it expresses, how the country's grown west and then jumped over here to California, kind of how the country's filling out. You'll notice too, all of this, right? It's mainly in the upper northwest. The south, really, there isn't a lot of immigration change in population. We'll talk more about that. In 1850, the population was 23 million, right? Here we are 40 years later, and we've nearly tripled, right? So the country is exploding very fast. The biggest cities are New York, Chicago, Philadelphia. We'll talk about those two cities as we get into this. I was going to spend some time talking about technology because the telephone is invented, running water starts happening, electricity, gas, all of these things start to happen, right, in the 1870s, 1880s. That's when they invent the light bulb and all these things. But there's this cool chart, the technology chart, this kind of a technology adoption chart, flushing toilet, running water, vacuum, all these different things that you can draw across here and see when this technology gets adopted. It was always striking to me that in 1920, 20% of households had running water. It's like, how is that possible? I'm in Fort Worth. I think of Fairmount. All those houses had running water. They had electricity. And I think about, Fort Worth, and just sitting there doing the math. McFarland had running water, it's 1890s, and so I'm like, what? How could so few houses have running water? Well, when we talk about the population and the urban population, in 1890, only 35% of the country lived in cities, right? And so most people lived on farms. And we don't get into over 50% living in the cities until like 1940 or 1950. So you can see this adoption really starts happening 1920 to 1940, that you see, electricity in a house, gas in a house, running water, flushing toilets, right? All of these different things. So we're going to talk more about the technology and what it does to housing in the arts and crafts period, which is the next period. But just so you know, even though these things have been invented, the adoption doesn't really take place until about 1920 and later. So running water is in the 1880s. About 15% in 1900 have toilets. And again, I'm sitting there doing the math. I'm sitting there, McFarland had toilets. So electricity, 10% of the people have electricity in 1909. So anyway, it's just kind of interesting how that technology adopts. This is a map of distribution of rural and urban populations, okay? And it's broken up into 5 sectors. Notice this sector, okay, which is the Northeast, New York. In 1890, okay, is that right? Majority of the New York, where's my thing? Yeah, majority of New York was living in the cities, right? So kind of an interesting statistic, because if you go down to the South, probably 10% lived in cities, right? And so depending on where you are in the country, this is a very urbanized area of the country, mainly because of New York, but Philadelphia, New York, all those big cities are right in this area, so you have a lot of growth here. Chicago happens up in this area, so that kind of affects that. But really the South, look, in 1960, percent of people living in cities versus a rural environment is still, 25% or something? So depending on the region where you are, and this affects our housing, right? This affects what our houses look like. This affects the vernacular house, right, happens in these rural areas, right? A vernacular house doesn't really happen, generalization, doesn't really happen in a city like this. You begin to see more formalized housing. For instance, Fairmount again, which is one of the largest bungalow neighborhoods in the country. Those are fairly well-informed bungalow houses, right? You can recognize them. There's some clear identifying details. Whereas that you go out to the country in that period, and they get a little fuzzy as far as their architectural integrity. So that's the reason why that's important. Okay, so the rise of the city. I'm going to mainly focus on Chicago. It was one of the fastest growing cities in the country for many decades. And if you remember, if I can go back to one of these maps, right? Chicago's right here, okay? And the reason Chicago grows, and if you remember when we talked about the 1860s, that the most populous cities were on the East Coast, but then Buffalo, which was Erie Canal and the lakes, Chicago had another canal, and we talked about Cincinnati last time, right on the Ohio River, that because of the railroad, because of canals, because of steam-powered steamboats, right, that could move up and down, there was like 5 cities where they were in the top 5 cities. New Orleans was one, St. Louis, Cincinnati, Chicago, and Buffalo, right, were big cities at that time. So Chicago, because it's connected to the Great Lakes, because the Erie Canal, it essentially, you can go from Chicago to New York and ship goods and services. They have another canal, just like Cincinnati did, that connected them to the Mississippi River. Therefore, it's connected to St. Louis and New Orleans, becomes a very important city. It grew so fast, though, that they had all kinds of problems, okay? Sewage was running backwards into the city. And so they had a tremendous, they had to basically engineer the river so that it flowed out of the city instead of into the city, because they were dumping their sewage into the lake, but it would just float back into the city. It was terribly dirty, right? But that highlights the fact that cities were growing so fast, no one knew, right? It wasn't like there was a model, oh, this is what you do when you grow by 1 million people, right? And so they're growing very fast. It's the fastest growing city for very long. It has the railroad. It's a huge railroad hub that has the canal. All this technology happening is right on the edge of the West. Things are expanding from there. In 1871, there's a huge fire. And by 1900, they're the 5th largest city in the world, right? So the technology and the engineering and the other things that they did to rebuild their city, one of the reasons you have so many high rises in Chicago is because it burnt down and they had this opportunity to rebuild. At the same time, the technology for how you did a high rise changed, right? So the limit on a high rise, because of masonry, just what a brick could support, was about 10 floors, okay? So they would build these high rises and they would have 6 feet of brick at the base going up to about 2 feet at the top, okay? So they had all this, they had to engineer it so that it could stand up to that height. At the same time, they then started putting steel in, was that 1891, right? And that's what this building is one of the very first steel skyscrapers, which allowed them to go to like 16 stories, okay? Allowed them to go much taller, and you begin to see, after 1890, buildings getting taller and taller. This is the Fisher Building, 1895. And so realize that what this means is that we're no longer building traditionally, okay? We are no longer having masons build up a tall building. You are having a steel frame and you're hanging materials from the steel frame. Very different way of building. The other thing that you have to think about is, how do you plumb a building that's 16 stories tall, right? What kind of infrastructure do you have to have the plumbing pipes come down the wall? Where is it going, right? What kind of, you're changing the whole city's infrastructure, plumbing system. How do you get water pressure at the top of a building, right? All of these different things that you don't really think about are happening in this 20, 30-year period between 1870 and 1890 as they're figuring this thing out. Another thing that happened in 1899, there was a very important book called How the Other Half Lives. And it was all pictures of tenement housing in New York, okay? And pictures like this of the kids sleeping in the street and the filth and squalor and the trash and everything else changed the way people thought about, cities, right? Changed the way people, they were like, it was an aha, uh-oh moment where they looked at what was happening in their cities and they were like, something's got to change. We've got to do something better. At the same time, in 1876, there's the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia, okay? That is the 100-year anniversary of our country, okay? remember World's Fairs? Okay, there used to be something before the internet. The very first one, 1851, is in London with the Crystal Palace, right? That's where Samuel Colt brought his revolver, and they were freaked out that they had the revolver with interchangeable parts. So after 1851, all these countries are kind of jumping over each other, and it became a big engineering fair. Okay, it became a big thing where every country came in to show off what they were doing and what was going on. The other one was in Chicago in 1893, and this was called the White City. Okay, if you've read Eric Larson's book Devil in the White City, it's all about a serial killer that also is a part of the building of the White City. This is huge. Okay, and the Centennial Exposition starts it. We're going to visit this again when we talk about the arts and crafts period, because there's a Japanese pagoda, which is very influential on Green and Green and Frank Lloyd Wright. And they look at that thing, and the whole Japanese architecture comes because they see a pagoda at the Chicago's exposition. So this is a very influential thing. It's also influential because it changes the way cities think about growth and the way cities think about how they, manage things. One of the things this exposition did was it had I think it was on like 16 or 26 acres. It was a ton of land, and it was very organized, okay? And so they looked at the great architecture of Europe and said, the grand boulevards and the parks and the organization and the beauty of those European cities, they are trying to capture here. And so there was very distinct canals. There was accesses where things would line up and you would see things. It was organized very beautifully, and it became incredibly influential for city planners. Now, we're going to talk about all these architects because there's a bunch of very important architects that worked here. But this starts what's called the City Beautiful movement. And we were just in Coral Gables, Florida. Anybody been to Coral Gables? There's the Biltmore there. That was a City Beautiful city, okay, that basically was organized and laid out according to these axes that had at ended points. You had beautiful boulevards, you had fountains that you would drive around, very European. And many U.S. cities began to design their parks and their systems because of this exposition. Very important. The McMillan Plan, 1901, the mall in Washington, D.C. Remember we were talking about, in the first one we were talking about A.J. Downing, the horticulturist. Okay, he had a plan for the mall. He was asked to redesign the mall, and instead of having the open grass, he actually had English gardens in the mall, if you can imagine that. It never got built, but he had a whole design for the mall. But this was, we had L'Enfant plan from when we talked about the federal period and the rise of Washington, D.C. He had this plan. They take it over in this thing and say, we're going to accomplish this beautiful thing. 1922, the Jefferson Memorial, the Lincoln Memorial, all of those are part of the City Beautiful movement, creating these axes and these beautiful monuments that are part of giving back to the people of the city, right? This is a way that the city should serve its people by creating beautiful spaces so that they have a wonderful place to live. Now realize the tenement problem, right, with the trash and everything else, it takes 20, 30 years for these things to develop and happen, but New York had a plan in 1902, Buffalo, New York, I have that picture. San Antonio Riverwalk, that was part of the City Beautiful movement, right, which is pretty cool. This is in Philadelphia. That's the Philadelphia Museum. This is called the Benjamin Franklin Parkway. You can see the design for it here. There's the Philadelphia Museum here. And then just keep an eye on her, okay? That is Gaudin's Diana. This is the ICAA, but just remember her, okay? She's sitting right in there. But this is all part of their plan. I went to Buffalo, and you know, when you see monuments like these with the lions and the obelisk and the city hall here, and you see the way this is laid out, and Frederick Law Olmsted helped lay out the city. It's a garden city, beautiful accesses, wonderful things to look at. That's all part of that City Beautiful movement. Now, going to need a flow chart here. The guys who led this thing, okay, are the who's who that influence building and design here for the next little while. And we're going to talk about these architects. This is Louis Sullivan, Richard Morris Hunt. There's McKim Mead and White, and there's H.H. Richardson, okay? If you remember, don't look here, okay? Benjamin Latrobe, he's kind of the first professional architect to come here. He trained a guy named Robert Mills. There was a guy named Thomas Walter who worked under him. Charles Bulfinch had Asher Benjamin, who trained at the Old Town, who teamed up with A.J. Davis. Remember all these people, right? There's this family tree of architects, and they're all connected. There's a school in Paris called the École des Beaux-Arts, right? Which is the School of Fine Arts. It is a very famous art school. There was a art program there, and there was an architecture program there. It was thought that the School of Fine Arts in France was the best school for architecture. Now, this is in the 1850s, 1860s. There is no architecture program in America, right? There is no school for architecture. And so Richard Morris Hunt, who kind of grew up kind of a dandy, he built the Biltmore, okay? He did the Met, okay, the New York Met. He did the base of the Statue of Liberty, the pedestal that she sits on. Very important, 1827, 1895. He is the first American grad of the School of Fine Arts in France. Big deal, right? He comes back. The reason he gets clients like the Vanderbilts and stuff like that is because he's one of the first trained famous guy that does that. When he comes back to his office, there's a program that the School of Fine Arts did. It's called an atelier, okay? An atelier program means that you copy the past, okay? You draw and you copy the past, and then you get in a studio, a group of people that you all draw together and you work on these problems together, okay? It is kind of there was the modern way of designing and doing an office. He trains all these young people underneath him, one of which is a guy named William Ware. Now, this is in New York. So he has the atelier in his office, and he trains this guy, William Ware. Now, William Ware goes back to Boston, and he starts an office, and he has an atelier in his office, and the people from MIT came to him and said, we want to do that at school. Will you come start an architecture program at MIT? So he goes, yeah, okay. So he goes to MIT, and about 15 years later, Columbia comes along and says, we want to hire you away because we want to start an architecture program. So they hire him away, and he works at Columbia for a long time. His program and the methods of his teaching before he started these programs, he went to this School of Fine Arts, he went and traveled around Europe, found out what the best systems were, and came back and based the training of American architects on this School of Fine Arts, okay? Now, he then has all these people who are influenced under him. There's another guy, H.H. Richardson, which we'll talk about in a sec. He went to the School of Fine Arts. He's the second American to go there. He went there for a year. McKim Mead and White, two of those guys trained under Richardson. McKim went to the School of Fine Arts. You're seeing a pattern here. All these guys are connected, okay? And you'll see that as we go forward here. But all these guys know each other. All these guys are trained the same way, and they go from there. So the AIA forms in 1857. Who does that? Richard Morris Hunt, okay? He is the one who was organized in the office in New York. He's the one who becomes the grandfather of the AIA and starts that in 1857. First tool at MIT, I was wrong, it's 1868, not 1881. He starts that, and that's William Ware. The first builder paper or architect paper is this paper in 1876. And then Columbia starts their program in 1881. Now, what's interesting is that William Ware, when he went to Columbia, couldn't get a strict architecture program because they wanted it tied to the School of Mines, okay? And basically that was an engineering program. And so there's the fight between, are we training artists or are we training, guys who know how to build? And I think that's a, a conversation that goes on in architecture schools today. And so, you know, are we doing great design stuff or are we doing practical building things? And that was a problem for them at Columbia when he was starting his program. Now, the reason they do it, and it was interesting, there's a whole book on the start of Columbia University, and the reason he gets funding of the board. So one guy says, you need to start a program at Columbia. He has to go to the Board of Regents and they have to approve the program, right? The Board of Regents says, we don't need an architecture program. And they say, well, yeah, we do, because think about the tenements, think about the problems in these buildings. And literally one guy said, we're having Irish plumbers plumb these buildings and they don't know what they're doing. Kind of a racist statement. I'm Irish. I kind of take offense at that. And so they were basically saying, cheap building, no one knows how to build these tall buildings with the plumbing and everything else so that they work. We've got to have architects because we need them to know how to build. And it wasn't about building something beautiful and designing something beautiful. It was about designing cities that work. And so realize that that was that conflict that was going on there. Richard Morris Hunt, first to graduate there. And then these two guys both attend for a year, and then McKim Mead and White, McKim went to there. Now, so I want to study three of these architects, okay? H.H. Richardson, McKim Mead and White, and Louis Sullivan, okay? So we'll get into Frank Lloyd Wright next time and study these guys. But remember, we're still talking about the city, and you'll start to see some houses come out of these guys' work, but these guys are kind of the driving force of design and beauty, right, during this time. 1886, he dies young, he dies at 47. He studied at the school. He is greatly influential on McKim Mead and White because McKim and White both worked in Richardson's office for him. He's thought to be kind of the top three architects with Louis Sullivan and Frank Lloyd Wright as kind of the top three guys in America in this time as far as design prowess. He does this style of architecture called Romanesque, okay? He dies young, and after he dies, there's a style Richardson Romanesque, right? Because it's a style based on Richardson's work. And so Richardson Romanesque is a Romanesque style, but because he's the one that kind of drove that, that's where it gets famous. Now, Trinity Church in Boston. Anybody seen this building? Great Romanesque building, right? See the medieval elements that are going on here, kind of French and other kind of details there, but very heavy, right? Very thick. 1872. Ironically, we're going to look at McKim and White. Across the street of that is the Boston Public Library. And they studied under Richardson, but built the library across the street. This is the another library he did, right? Just see how heavy and thick that is, right? I mean, it is a massive building. It's hard to build a house like this because the scale is hard, right? Because these are massive boulders and massive things there. Yeah.
The Texas Capitol is Richardson.
We're going to look at a bunch of Texas courthouses.
Okay. Texas Capitol.
I don't think the Capitol is.
Oh, it's not?
I don't think so. It's neoclassical. I don't think it's Romanesque. But we can talk about it. I'll show you some that are. This is after he dies. This is a Romanesque building. Look at the similarity between these two, right? There's one he did, and see the little tower in the arch, and then there the little tower in the arch. Again, medieval, right? Looks like a heavy Florence medieval building, but that's part of kind of his style. This is a Marshall Fields, also looks like a Florence building, but a Medici building or something, 1887 after he died. Very influential. Louis Sullivan, 1856 to 1924. He is part of the Chicago School of Architects. And there's a whole school of architects from Chicago because remember, Chicago is growing so fast. They've got all these buildings to build, all this design stuff they need to do. He obviously influences Frank Lloyd Wright because Frank Lloyd Wright works for him, okay? And so is moonlighting and ended up getting fired by him because of his moonlighting. He's considered the father of the architect, the skyscraper, and of course, form follows function. Who's heard of that thing, huh? Okay, Louis Sullivan is the one who said that, okay? It is the pervading law of all things organic and inorganic, of all things physical and metaphysical, all things human and all things superhuman, of all the true manifestations of the head, of the heart, and of the soul, that the life is recognizable in the expression that form ever follows function. This is the law. Now, this phrase, form follows function, has been screwed up and messed up for a long time because people used it to say there's no ornamentation, okay? Things should be very strict and there should be no ornamentation, but you'll look at his buildings and you'll see that they're incredibly ornamented. And so he did not think that. This is actually comes from Vitruvius. If we go all the way back to the Georgian period, Vitruvius, who was the only Roman engineer, wrote about firmus, utilitas, and veritas, and which is about what the three qualities a building should have, which it should be useful, it should be well built, and it should be beautiful. Okay, so that's what Louis Sullivan was talking about when he talks about form follows function. Now, if you've ever seen one of his buildings, they're fantastic. Okay, I was in Buffalo for a conference, and I got to see their incredible city hall, and then I also saw the guarantee of the Prudential building. And it's a bank building, Adler Sullivan, 1894. I don't know if you're going to be able to see all this detail and everything in here. You can see that. It's he used terracotta, okay, but he would create these ornamental forms, and they're incredibly beautiful. I sat there and stood and kept trying to capture this building with my camera. But it's overwhelming. If you stand across the street, like if you look at this thing, you really don't see much of that, okay? But when you get close to it, you start looking and going, oh my gosh, this is incredibly well built, incredibly well designed and thought through. This requires a building that terracotta is not a structural material. This is really something that has to hang on a steel frame. So this really couldn't have happened 10 or 15 years earlier. So, right, so all these technologies and all these things are happening right now, and he figures out a way to make the skyscraper the most beautiful thing on the street. Anyway, it's a stunning building. If you ever get to go there, it's very special. This is the Chicago Trade Arch. This is actually in Chicago. You can see 1893. There's the building. There was the arch. There was the skyscraper. It got torn down, but they saved the arch, and it's now in a park. So Sullivan was probably the only true modernist here, and we'll start talking about modernism, okay, as it develops. But really, we should point to guys like Sullivan who are doing things that are a little bit different. The White City, okay, had all these East Coast architects come, and a few Chicago architects, Burnham and Root, and then Sullivan and some others. But there was Richard Morris Hunt did a building, McKim Mead and White did a building, and theirs was very classical Beaux-Arts, okay, which is that French classicism, very ornate. This is what Sullivan did, right? Kind of, it's modern, it's different from this, style and this kind of deal. And so he was the one who kind of zigged where the other guys zagged. And he ended up getting burned for that because after the panic of 1893, there was a recession. He never really recovers. And so the last part of his career, he lives till 1924, he ends up doing these buildings in like Iowa, and this one's in Minnesota, where he practices some of these things, but he never gets the attention and acclimate that maybe he should have. And so this one's in Iowa, 1914, right? You can still see him practicing that ornamentation, but very interesting, cool buildings. Now, anybody read The Fountainhead? Okay. Fountainhead is basically about these two. Now, it's not word for word, but Ayn Rand was known to have been researching Frank Lloyd Wright and Louis Sullivan. And as I said, Frank Lloyd Wright worked for Sullivan, okay, and was one of his lead designers, but was also moonlighting, okay? And so in this book, Henry Cameron is kind of the main guy, or the older guy, and Howard Roark is the young guy who comes up underneath them. Louis Sullivan in real life really did kind of lose his business, lose his way, never had the success and fame that his young protege had. And so if you want to read a book about these two, that's what The Fountainhead is about. And it's about kind of architecture and this guy kind of losing his way and this guy being this rising star and eclipsing the guy who inspired him and trained him. Kind of interesting.
Which building
I don't know. In the book, he blows up the building at the end. Okay, and then the last group is McKim Mead and White. Now, these guys are it. Okay, it's questionable whether Frank Lloyd Wright's the most influential architect or what these guys did. It's three partners. Charles Fulham McKim. He was kind of the connections guy. He was the well-heeled blue blood guy. Mead had studied some architecture, but really, was not the architectural talent. He was the one who ran the office. He was the one who made the business work. And then Stanford White was this creative force. He worked under H.H. Richardson for a long time, was H.H. Richardson's lead guy, and they, for about 20 years, do everything. I mean, they are uneclipsed as far as their volume of work and the things that they were able to do in a very short period of time. It starts with Madison Square Garden. This one's obviously been torn down. This is the Harvard Club. And look who I find, okay? There's Diana. She was up on the Madison Square Garden. She was 18 feet tall and weighed 1,800 pounds and on a tiptoe. And he originally had her wearing clothes, but it blew off. She comes down and they try to redo her. Anyway, she ends up in the Philadelphia Museum like 20 years later. But that's where she started. And it's Godin, who's this incredible sculptor. Love his stuff. But this is this balance and poise that is her on her tiptoes shooting this arrow. Try doing that. Try standing and doing that. Look perfectly balanced. It's wonderful the way it's put together. But so McKim Mead and White, they worked with the most talented craftsmen. They had the best projects, and they just did everything. Columbia University, their whole campus, this is the Low Library. You can see that they get their inspiration in classicism. So this is neoclassical, this is Beaux-Arts, right? Beaux-Arts is that French school. When you see their Beaux-Arts, heavily ornamented, droopy, drapey swags and details like that, that's Beaux-Arts. The New York Public Library is Beaux-Arts. If you've ever been there, it's an incredible Beaux-Arts building. They did the Arch in Washington Square. This is the New York Library at New York University. Beautiful buildings. Obviously, this looks like the Parthenon, but based in classicism, they determine kind of what these cities look like, and the whole city beautiful movement is pushed by designs and art like this, and that's why so many things look the way they do. This is Pennsylvania Station. They got tragically torn down. Considered one of the finest buildings they ever did. The light in there was incredible, and it got torn down to build a very ugly Madison Square Garden. This was their building at the Great White City. It was the agriculture building. I mean, look at that, right? And so the way they built that White City was all on plaster, and they painted it white. And so it was basically a temporary building meant to come down. And they did that a lot at these World's Fairs. I mean, that does not look like it's going to fall down, right? That does not look like it's temporary, but they were built for very short term. This is the Boston Public Library, built across the street from Trinity Church. A beautiful building. If you look inside, right, what a tremendous building, right? And see this kind of the lion in this entry hall. This is science, right? Gazing at the earth and trying to figure things out. It's just gorgeous, beautiful stuff, very inspiring. And they just did everything. They worked at the White House. They redid the rotunda at the UVA, which is maybe the most important architectural building in America. Great houses, great buildings. They were it. And they only ran for 20 years, right? So 1890 to 1910. And then Stanford White gets shot by a jealous lover, like in 1908 or something like that. And then Mead gets shot, or Mead dies. And so there was only one left. Anyway, it was kind of crazy, but for this brief period of time, they were it. Now, any questions about the city, right? Just kind of all that stuff, right? That's a lot in a very short span. Yes, sir.
One technical question. You mentioned terracotta that Louis Sullivan was doing in his buildings. Was that predominantly molded or was that carved?
It was molded.
Molded.
Yep. It was, yeah, it was. In fact, a friend of mine, Mark, bought Decorator Supply, which is an 1870s building in Chicago, and they had some original Louis Sullivan molds there that they did plaster molds for him and some of his buildings, which is pretty cool. Okay, so, right, I'm trying to capture at the end of this Victorian period, the city, which we can't ignore, is growing up, and then the houses. Now, in this Victorian period, we talked about the Gothic Revival, Italian, Second Empire last time, but look at all these different styles, right? There's stick style, Eastlake, Carpenter Gothic, Queen Anne, Shingle, Romanesque, Colonial Revival, Octagonal, Chateauesque, Italian Revival, Neoclassical. Now, we're not going to look at all of these, but it becomes, it's a little bit overwhelming. If you've ever looked at a Victorian house and like, I'm not sure what style house that is, that's because that's on purpose. It just, and especially if we talk about the Queen Anne style, which this is considered the greatest Queen Anne house in the world, is the Carson Mansion. It was in Eureka, California. He was a lumber dealer. That's over the top, right? But the Queen Anne was asymmetrical. It was a combination of different styles. It's named after Queen Anne, but there's no association decoratively, right? Queen Anne was a queen in England 150 years before this, but there's supposed to be English elements in the Queen Anne, but what you'll see is you'll see there are different, as we go up and some of these looks at these other, it's almost like every little piece is a different piece, and they would borrow and mix and choose. You'll see brick on the bottom, siding in the middle, shingles at the top, all kinds of crazy things. So if you look at these houses and go, I don't know what it is, it's because they borrowed from so many different things, it's very difficult to see. Wraparound porches, towers are very popular during this period. The different textures, second story porches like that are very popular in this time period. This is, kind of a mild Queen Anne compared to the other one, but you see we got siding down here, then it goes to shingles up here. We've got a tower, we've got a second floor roof, we've got a wraparound porch. Yeah, all kinds of fun stuff. You get into some eclectic, Persian, onion top things. Again, siding here, shingles here. Sunbursts were kind of a popular detail. But it's almost like if we looked at that, we go, that's a little colonial revival element. Oh, well, that is a French chateauesque element, right? All of these different things happening on these Queen Anne houses, and they liked it that way, right? Remember we talked about the industrialization of millwork, and we'll talk a little bit more about that today, but they're doing some of this because they can, right? This is the first time that they can build and do and create all of these crazy spandrels and finials and brackets and all the crazy things that they're doing on these buildings. This is a Queen Anne, but has some stick elements, right? When you see this kind of framing detail where you're seeing almost the timbers coming through there, that's a stick element. But I mean, there are again 3 or 4 different styles of things there. Notice the shingle patterns that goes from fishtail to square to diamond patterns, right? It's just because we can. The shingle style. So the shingle style is a little bit more driven by architects, okay, than plan books. This is McKim Mead and White. This is it's called the Newport Tennis Association. It's the Hall of Fame now, but it was 1890s. This is H.H. Richardson did this one. This is kind of the first shingle style. You'll notice in the shingle style there's heavy forms, okay, and kind of big blocks of building massive things. Oftentimes there's stone at the base of it, but you do see some Victorian elements in there, right? This kind of decorative stuff, but it's just a little bit heavier, a little bit more solid, a little bit more chunky, and most often covered in shingles, right? That's the reason it's called a shingle style, is because there's shingles all over it, as you can see there. This is a McKim Mead and White house, right? Shingles all over it. There is some Victorian decoration and things, but it's a heavy, massive. Typically, they weren't painted. Typically, they were just left like this. They became very popular in Newport and on the East Coast. They were when fresh air became something that was. We want fresh air because we're healthy and things like that. That's when you have a lot of these coastal towns and things blowing up and getting larger because it was very healthy to live that way. Very important in that shingle style. A couple other shingle houses. This one's painted, but you do see the rock at the bottom and that same kind of form. And then that one a little bit still massive, kind of morphs out and kind of grows out of a form. It's not as crisp and detailed as the other style. Then Romanesque. So it's Richardson Romanesque, right? It happens after he dies. This is a style inspired by that medieval architecture. And realize that it isn't just H.H. Richardson who's inspiring a lot of this. It is all of the travel, and the world's expanding and opening up to so many different things. They're able to see more. And so they see medieval buildings. They see French chateaus. They see these things, and they're inspired by it. So it's not just simply Richardson's thing. It is actually being open to the whole world. They're starting to travel more, and you begin to see these styles and these forms come together. But again, I mean, if you started breaking these little pieces out and looked at the individual elements with the turrets, which are very important, typically on a Romanesque building, you'll see these large arches, these heavy arches. But it's because of the scale of these and the size and weight of these materials that it's hard to do a house successfully. Here's the Hopkins County Courthouse, which we've worked on, in the Romanesque style. Dallas County Courthouse is certainly a old red museum, which we've worked on, in the Romanesque style. Beautiful building. And then Ellis County Courthouse, which we've worked on. Another beautiful building, right? But you see the medieval elements, you see these heavy arches, that's all part of that Romanesque style. Neoclassical, right? So you begin to see back to kind of those temple forms coming out. It could be colonial revival in some respects, but typically this large front porch that goes up like this. Thistle Hill has a little bit of that when its new porch as it grows up like that. This is the Kell House in Wichita Falls, which we're working on, but it's neoclassical with this heavy form. Big porches, side porches, very typical of that style, symmetrical. Chateau Est is the Biltmore, Richard Morris Hunt, right? Is kind of that French style, French chateau, became very popular, especially among the rich. Another Chateau Est style. You see these turrets, these French turrets that go up, very typical of that look.
Also very expensive.
Yeah. And then Beaux-Arts, we talked about the School of Fine Arts, the School of Beaux-Arts, des Beaux-Arts, okay? It generated a whole style. This is the New York Public Library. Carrie and Hastings, who studied under McKim, Mead and White, they did this then. Has anybody been there, been here? Oh my gosh. Go there, next trip. It is unbelievable. It is a cathedral to learning and study and books, and it's just a fabulous, fabulous, beautiful, beautiful building. There's the inside of it. It's been in a bunch of movies. Love this thing. A good book is the precious lifeblood of a master spirit, embalmed and treasured upon purpose to a life beyond life. Yes! Yes! Learning, books. It's just fabulous. It's a beautiful, beautiful building. So, there's so many different styles here. What I wanted to do is have a little quiz. You will be graded later. And I want to just go through what style is it. How should we do this? Just raise your hand. Don't blurt it out, okay? This is, I'll start off this is the Mark Twain house, okay? This is kind of a trick, but because I don't get it, okay? I know what style they say it is, but I don't see it. So, who has a guess? Chris?
Stick style.
It's not stick style.
It's not.
No. I would have probably guessed stick style. They say it's a Gothic revival, okay? Now, here's the problem with this, okay? And I started this one on purpose because it's confusing, right? This steep pitch could be Gothic, right? That has Gothic form, but there's no barge boards there. There's no real dripping barge boards things that are going on there. There's no hood moldings over the windows. There's no Gothic arches in there, right? I just don't see it. And so that's what they're calling it. I could go stick, I could go Queen Anne, I could go, some of these other different things. And so it's asymmetrical, it's, it has all these just funny things. Mark Twain called it Steamboat Gothic or pudding pie. I mean, it's just like, he had these funny terms for it because he didn't see it either. So it's not clear. So there's no wrong answers, okay? That's the point. I didn't want to intimidate you guys too bad. So the painted ladies in California, right? The very famous 7 painted ladies. Guess? Queen Anne. Everybody got that one? Isn't this fun? Okay, there's a famous house. This is Frank Lloyd Wright's studio. What style is that? Shingle, yes, that's right. I was actually surprised when I was reading that. And I just Googled Victorian houses and started picking some, so this is not anything else. But there's a shingle style, Frank Lloyd Wright that did that. This is on Martha's Vineyard. This is Oak Bluff. What style are these? You can just blur it out now. No, they're calling it Gothic, okay? They call it Gothic Revival. And I see that in here, right? And this is kind of a Gothic Revival detail in there. But no, they're calling these Gothic Revivals. And I see that. See that little pointed arch there, right? That's, and the hood molding over this one. This one's more strongly Gothic than the other ones, but they're calling those Gothic Revival. This one? Who said that? Did you say that? Second Empire's right. Yeah. You can always tell Second Empire because of the mansard roof. Okay? So if you see the mansard roof, it's typically Second Empire. The problem is that oftentimes Second Empire have a lot of brackets here, which is typically an Italianate feature, but this is Second Empire. Kind of threw a curveball here. Early Victorian. Greek Revival. This is a Greek Revival house from 1820. This is Ithiel Town's house where he had a great library. Okay, this house. Italianate, right? Now there's the little curveball because they got a Second Empire little turret there, right? Kind of throw you a curveball. But this kind of bracketing detail is most typically Italianate. And good Italianate, you'll often see arched windows in there. But that's kind of a typical Italianate. Stick. This is stick style. Now we didn't go over stick, but I told you that the stick had this forms where the timbers come through. Again, this is an adaptation of an English Tudor timbered house, right? Done in a Victorian manner, right? Where instead of having bricks and stuff between the timbers, you're actually having siding going through there. But seeing that kind of form come up like that is typically a stick style house. Gothic, right? So you see this deal here. Again, you got a Second Empire tower, but you've got definitely the Gothic windows, right? And this kind of porch detail. Hard to see those clustered columns there. It's a famous Gothic Revival house. This is folk Victorian, okay? So this would be a vernacular, countryside, a Victorian house. There was probably more detail originally. It's been taken over after time, but it's not strong. But this is why Victorian, and I wanted to do this to have fun. Isn't this fun? Because it's hard to tell, right? And so it's no wonder that you walk up to these Victorian houses and go, what is that? And so it's oftentimes better to know the age of it to help put it into a time frame than it is to be able to look at it from the front. And I get pictures, people send me pictures. I want to know what style my house is. And sometimes it just isn't, right? What? Stick. Yes, stick again. So we got that framing in there. Kind of typical, right? All right, so that was the last one. Wasn't that fun? Everybody got an A. Good job. Okay, so any questions about the houses as we look at those? I'm going to talk about the building side of things here. But any questions about the styles, Victorian styles, anything? So I want to talk briefly as we kind of wrap up about millwork. And before, I talked to you about the early stages of industrialization and what it did to millwork. But now I want to talk to you about the second half after Civil War ends in 1865 and the explosion of millwork that takes place that affects us, okay? It affects us in Fort Worth, Texas, especially because that middle band, right, this little middle band was called the National Sash Door and Blind Manufacturers Northwest, okay, which was Chicago. So it wasn't Northwest over here, it was Northwest there, because that's how far the country had gone apart. This was established in about 1880. Clinton, Iowa, which is where that little star is, on the Mississippi River, just down from Wisconsin and Minnesota, is this mecca of woodworking. They call it the lumber capital of the world at one point, Clinton, Iowa, about 10,000 people there. At one point, 1892, there was these guys, Weyerhaeuser came from there, the Curtis Brothers Millwork. There was more millionaires per capita in Clinton, Iowa than anywhere else in the world. And so it was an explosion happens here. And essentially what happens is they are harvesting all these white pine trees out of Minnesota and Wisconsin, and they're floating them down the river on these large barges. They would rope trees together, these logs together, and they'd float them down to these mills. And so there's Du Bois, Clinton, and a few others on this little path in Iowa that just explode with millwork things. And so this one, this is St. Louis, right? So a little bit further down the river right here is St. Louis, and there was mills there. But essentially these mills grow up and they build everything, okay? They do moldings, they do doors, they do stairs, they do built-ins, everything that you would put in a house after the 1870s, they made. And because the railroad, right, 1869, the country's connected, railroads just are springing across the country. They are shipping things all over. So not only can they just be in a small town, but they're not selling millwork in Clinton, right? They're selling millwork in Chicago, in St. Louis, and Fort Worth, okay? So when we were working on the Ellis County courthouse, that courthouse, we had white pine doors on the inside. We're like, where did these come from? And they found a bill of lading that came from St. Louis. And so they were white pine trees that came down the Mississippi River, were milled in St. Louis and shipped by railroad to Waxahachie, Texas, right? So but everywhere in this region, right, is influenced by the millwork that's happening here and for the next 40 years, right? And so is what happens right there in Clinton, Iowa, in this little town, as this kind of the perfect storm happens. They had a ready market, the country's exploding and growing very fast. They have the railroads to ship it, the tons of wood, more wood than they know what to do with. That wood lasts for about 30 years before they starts running out. And so just this perfect storm and millwork that just grows up out of nowhere. Realize that as a carpenter, right, this is a page from inside this book. This is an inside finish. You could order everything, right? The doors, the wainscot, the moldings, the trim, the glass. There wasn't anything, the hardware, that you couldn't get from these catalogs that they wouldn't send you and ship you, right? And so it's a one-stop shop. And this changes craftsmanship, it changes building, it changes how we think about building at that time. I remember talking to Gary Katz one time, and he saw these books and was like, he saw a built-in, he saw like a pantry shelf or it was a built-in nook. He's like, well, I thought a carpenter would have made that on site. He's like, nope, it came right from a catalog like this. The other thing that happens is Rand McNally printed this book. Okay, so this is this book, 1892. This is a different book, 1897. Do you see any similarities in the cover there? Right? And so they would stamp different names on these things. But Rand McNally is printing the exact same catalog and sending it to everybody. And so there's this, I've got 3 of these books that have this exact same cover that all have a different name on it. So there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of these books with different manufacturers selling their stuff. And a book like this would have gone to a lumber yard, and you know, and we'll see here these lumber yards were completely vertically integrated, had their own lumber yards, and you would order, you know, stair parts from there. And so it wasn't like you would have in the federal period or in the Georgian period, you'd have regional things. Things that happened in New York wouldn't happen in Boston, wouldn't happen in Baltimore, right? Now, we made moldings for a guy in Chicago one time, and we sent him, we have a molding catalog of all the moldings that come out of these books. And we sent him just our standard casing, and he goes, you know what, this thing lines up exactly with my original moldings that are in the house. He goes, how did you guys get so close? You know, well, we're copying the past, right? We're copying these same books, so everybody was using this. What this means is that houses become standardized, right? If you see, especially in the 1920s, okay, a bungalow house in Fort Worth will be very similar to one in Kansas City. It will be very one in Chicago, because they were working from the same plan books, and they were working, from the same millwork books, but also the same plan books, right? Everybody was using the same playbook. And so that's how houses are starting to be built. You no longer have a master builder anymore, because everybody's kind of ordering from the same kits. Isn't that interesting? I think it's interesting. This is a Gordon Van Tyne book. Sears and Montgomery Ward's gets in the millwork business, right? And they're shipping things. Next time we're talking about kit houses, right? And talk about, you know, houses by numbers, right? But this kind of captures the spirit of, you know, early 1900s, the way millwork would have been shipped by a rail car, you know, picked up in a horse and carriage and taken out to a job site, right? That there wasn't anywhere that these railroads couldn't reach and touch and deliver stuff. The Sears and Montgomery Ward catalogs speak to that, right? That they were shipping bicycles and stoves and all kinds of things by rail car all over the country. Kind of a perfect storm for how things grow. Example is Long Bell Lumber, okay? It's a Kansas City firm. These guys are a perfect place in time in the 1870s. They were selling hay, and they were trying to build a form for their hay, and the wood was so expensive that they tore the hay corral down and sold the lumber and said, we probably need to get into the lumber business. They were sold, 86 years later to International Paper Company. They were a very well-run company. An IBM kind of leadership and running of this company, in which they were completely vertically integrated. And, you know, what these companies would do was that they would start, and William Levitt did this in the 1950s, and we'll talk about him, but they would start having lumber. Instead of go, okay, we're going to go buy land in Louisiana first, and we're going to start our own mills, and they're going to cut their own lumber to supply their own lumber yards. And then because they were cutting lumber in Louisiana, it was yellow pine, they had all this leftover turpentine. And so they started a turpentine business. And because they started shipping things, and they started a railroad line. And so this company grows, and no matter what they touched, they said, well, we ought to be in that business. We ought to head and start doing that. They go out to Washington State and actually start what's called Longview, Washington, which was a company town. And because they were running out of longleaf pine or yellow pine in Louisiana, they go out to Washington and they start selling fir. And so I'm telling you this because these companies that were doing this were very smart, savvy companies that didn't miss a trick and grew very strong because they were in lumber. They got their teeth into a number of different businesses, building even company towns. They had their own homes catalogs. It says, well, we're selling the lumber, might as well not sell the plans for these houses so we can do this, right? So anything that they were seeing, well, why are we using their catalog? Let's just do our own catalog. It's kind of crazy what they're doing. They had their own nurseries, right? They were growing their own trees. I mean, it's crazy how savvy they were, and the fact that they got bought by International Paper in 1956, the fact that they made it through the Great Depression. They were selling, at one point they had, I think, 186 lumber yards around the country. They were selling 50 million board feet a year. It was just, I'm just telling you, the size of this company was Unbelievable. They make it through the Great Depression, they end up growing again, and they sold in 1956. So very savvy companies that were all over the country doing this stuff. Now, in closing, where am I now? Trying to capture this Victorian era, right? And there's my beautiful wife. A lot of people are asking about you. Glad you're here. Do you want me to start over? Industrialization, life is speeding up, okay? And this is important because in the arts and crafts period, they feel like their lives are going too fast, right? And you see this as the cities grow and these houses are exploding, going everywhere, and things, immigration's happening. The world is moving very fast, and buildings change. Okay, the building designer of Asher Benjamin and Ithiel Town become just builders, no longer designers, and the craftsmen become installers. All right, we're no longer making things, and that's a big deal on the building side, right? If you think about from 1830 to 1890, the way things changed, right? 1830, every wood part that went into a house was made by hand, right? They sawed the lumber, they planed the lumber, they made the moldings by hand. Everything was made by hand. By 1890, you're picking it up at a lumber yard or you're picking it up at a train yard, right? It's just, what is that, 60 years, right? It's just a few generations, and you no longer have the craftsmanship and the ability. Things are changing really fast. Plans which would have been hand drawn. We talked about Charles Bulfinch and the drawings and the details that they would do. In the early Romantic period, you begin to have guys like A.J. Davis, Alexander Jackson Davis, who actually is a beautiful artist and can actually do things. By the 1890s, you're buying them in plans. Ladies' Home Journal was a huge plan book company that was selling plans to ladies, and ladies were being involved in like picking out their home in their monthly magazine, right? The specs provided by an absent architect, right? Some of these early plan things, they were also sending out, because building becomes easier, right? You're no longer timber framing a house, you're nailing it together by hand, you have less skilled labor. So architects are actually having to specify how to build, okay? Again, this change from master builder to installer. The house timber frame, I was just saying, by skilled house wrights. Again, now it's nailed together. And the next time we're going to talk about house kits, right, that arrive, that literally have joists with a slot and a number so you know where to stick the 2x4, right? So you're talking about they're selling that house to a farmer who's never built before, right? They're selling that house to someone who doesn't have any skill and yet can still build their house. Decoration was only for the wealthy. Now decoration is very cheap and readily available, right? If you think about the catalogs, Decorator's Supply, Decorator's Supply, and did you lose internet back there? So then you have Decorator Supply and these companies that sell out of catalogs. You can order ornamentation out of catalogs, right? It's kind of crazy. Commercial buildings. Remember we talked about Washington, D.C. and that the U.S. Capitol was a timber frame building, right? And then by 1850, they have a steel frame and steel construction. And, in a very short period of time, building changes, okay? And let's see if I can get out of that. I'm almost done. I'm not sure if it matters. Oh boy. Anyway, there's no need for engineers and architects in the 1830s. By 1890s, you have to have them because buildings have changed so much. I think that's it. Oh, I was just going to show let me just get back there. Hang on. Any questions while I'm fighting technology? Yes, Alice.
So Benjamin Stanton asked, is it common for a second empire to be built with timber frame, mortise and tenon construction?
So, maybe. That's my answer. No. So what you see as balloon, and I talked about it last time with balloon framing. No one invented balloon framing. If you look at the catalogs from the 1870s about how to build, typically the floor plate, okay, was a timber. that wood was set into, okay? Now, as you went up, they oftentimes had regular studs, and then they would frame the upper part of the house in a balloon frame or another manner, but you'd have timbers in the basement and on the floor. So a combination of those things. I've got an MIT book from 1890 that has that kind of framing construction of a timber in the basement and, you know, regular studs like a balloon frame going up from there. So a combination is pretty typical until probably, and this could be a regional thing that you might have it in New England longer. At North Bennett Street, they had 2x4s in their things until the 1910s, right? By a 2x4 in 1890 in Fort Worth was 1.5 by 3.5, right? And so it's a regional thing, but it's a maybe, right? It depends where they are, depends when it was built, and it depends, you know, if it was in a city, depends how savvy the builder was, all those kind of things. Is that good? Okay, so I just want to kind of show what's happening with building and when we talk about these parts. This is Asher Benjamin. This is in the Philadelphia Museum if you want to go there. These things aren't very difficult, okay? The ornamentation would have been made in compo, right? So that would have been a carved form, and then composition molding, which was a sawdust and animal hide, would have been used for this kind of decoration. But not crazy, right, to make that by hand. A few different moldings, obviously highly skilled. This is a very, very high-end house that's obviously in a museum now in 1800. This is a Greek revival house. Just thinking about the technical prowess that would have been required to make these things. A lot of flat boards here, decoration in plaster, not in wood. So if you think about making these as a craftsman or carpenter today, again, not a huge deal. There's a molding there, 2, 3 moldings, right? But a lot of flat boards, not a huge thing. But again, a very elevated wood. This is in Philadelphia, a very high-end city, okay? And then this is anywhere in the 1890s, right? So it's stained grade wood. It's most likely a hardwood like oak or cherry or something like that. It's incredibly carved. It's incredibly ornate. There's an explosion of wood, right? Because it's cheap and fast. And if you compare, you know, these things, which are all paint grade, because it's very difficult to hand plane oak, okay? So there's a reason why Greek Revival, Georgian Federal houses are all paint grade, because there's all paint grade wood, okay? But when you get into the Victorian era with steam powered machines, molders and shapers and all the different things, you can do this, right? And so there's an excitement about this. Now, at the same time, there's also some regret going on here, and that's what we'll talk about with the arts and crafts period, is they look at this and they go, we've lost our soul to the machine, right? There's no more human touch here, and we've got to get back to that, which is what we'll discuss next time. But, you know, look at this house. I showed this last time, but this is 1796. This is 1869. Was that 73 years difference, right? A square box, you know, and wow, right? All different materials. Railroad allows you to bring in slate from a different part of the country. You can bring in battalion marble. You can bring in things from other parts of the world, which you could never do in this period of time. So building changes a ton during this period. So we're going to get back to the morality of architecture, right? Remember we talked about John Ruskin. We talked about some of these people who were talking about the soul of our architecture. We're going to get into that again. There's a new breed of leaders and designers. And this rejection of that ornamentation we just saw should be fun. Any questions? Okay, there's more beer. Help yourself to sandwiches. Thank you guys for coming.